2021. You were an awkward stepchild of a year, and you bloody know it. We were still in an abusive, love-hate relationship with COVID, sprinkled with government corruption the likes of which we've never seen, especially in the UK at least, and Akira felt prophetic as the Tokyo Olympics occurred despite protests that it should not happen. Art imitating life, everyone, it's fantastic. But one of the biggest things was seeing delayed film releases finally arrive on our doorsteps. And to say this year was a rounded disappointment for animated movies is an understatement. So many sequels to films I never originally saw or even cared about. A slew of lower budget films taking advantage of the open market on streaming services, and big budget studio names running hesitantly out of the gates and hoping for the best. But which were the ones best left avoided? Easily reviled and just not worth the time at all. With the criteria restricting my choices viewable on screen right now, it's time to kick back and see what grinded my gears the most, and made for unpleasant watching in the process, as I unveil my 5 worst animated feature films of 2021. But before I start, here's the dishonourable mentions that didn't make the cut. Hiko's Journey, a good thematic backbone critiquing Mexico's long-standing government corruption, the greed of corporations, and the consequences of fracking, did not save a film that couldn't decide whether it wanted to be an educational film for children or biting socio-political commentary. And they thought, why not both? The result? A film crippled by a clashing, inconsistent combination of cheap 2D and needlessly overburdened 3D animation, irritating characters that outstayed their welcome, and a trundling plot that was infantile tedium incarnate. It had something to say, and I was willing to hear it, yet it bungled the execution so terribly, which was quite depressing to see unfold. Bombay Rose, hand-painted in the famed Mughal style by over 60 artists, this surprising subversion of what's expected of an Indian film to worldwide audiences disappoints greatly thanks to uneven pacing, an undercooked romance story, flaccid scripting, and weak voice acting. It also didn't help that even the animation's impact chiseled away at your patience by repeating symbolic motifs en masse to pad the film's runtime out. Despite being full of dark, insidious, and biting socio-political substance that I was very happy to see, it was so freaking boring. Daring to be different, yes, but not able to capitalise on a selling point that shouldn't have been as hollow as it was. Earwig and the Witch, Studio Ghibli finally made a full-on dud. Never thought I'd ever end up saying that. It's well voiced, plus character models and environments in 3D are well made, meaning it does have some charm. However, in motion, story, character development, and tone, everything else fails. The plasticky animation is awkward, stilted, and limiting to where any sense of whimsy and magic is lost instantaneously, burdened by a plot that develops and progresses pretty much nothing, whilst the obtrusive score accents your gradually unabated frustration. It felt unfinished and lacking in any motive substance at all, really. Beautiful looking stills couldn't deliver on the potential. If this TV special was released online for free instead of full price in cinema and home media, it would have suffered less from the expectations attached. Seeing the 2D drawings of these 3D characters in the credits, though, makes one lament for what might have been. Trouble, or Doggone Trouble in international markets, a film that is nothing more than Secret Life of Pets Classist Edition, derivative as all hell. When a film spoils and deceives the contents of its own plot on the promotional material, you know you've got a turkey on your hands. Forgettable animation, overacted voice performances, and irritable time wasting with some of the most one-note and detestable characters I have seen in a long time, this film set itself up for failure from the start, especially when you want to strangle the egocentric lead dog you're supposed to root for, no matter how cute he looks. When most of, if not all, involved in the story are just doing things to pad it out and fill the runtime with no sense of urgency for a story that you just don't care about, there is just no hope for it. If not for Wilmer Valderrama's eccentric saving grace, this would have made the list. And with all that out of the way, it's now time to look at the crap-covered wooden spoons. You know a film sucks when even the people making it trip over themselves. The producers didn't want it to focus on the titular characters that they were willing to milk money out of. Corporate Hollywood working at its finest. A Tom and Jerry film that is more about Chloe Grace Moretz committing identity fraud, playing the role of a down-on-her-luck teen whilst giving less than a fuck about it, as hotel staff full of eccentrics and preening narcissists make everything that isn't solely focused on the cat and mouse shenanigans I came for basically unwatchable. You never think a film could be so contemptible, and yet here we are. This is what Tom and Jerry is. A bloated and remarkably uninteresting series of events with characters who are either one-note or disparagingly annoying, giving us marketing exercise in nostalgia that doesn't even attempt to hide its callous and shallow nature. Slap the name of a beloved IP on it, conjure up some random way to get them into this gigantic narrative white elephant, and make them supporting characters to ones who make the whole watching experience unpalatable. It's a recipe for disaster, and comes across as such once human characters subsequently dominate, submerging its pacing into freezing water forevermore. When we're given time to see Tom and Jerry doing Tom and Jerry things, an equilibrium in the space-time continuum emerges, where all feels right as we get to see these lifelong enemies being as they are, masters of slapstick physical prop-based comedy. So sectioning them off whilst stuff we don't care about happens alongside or in the background of it is a slap in the face. While they look good and are faithful to their expected designs, the way that they're implemented into the live action is jarring, rather, looking more unnatural once you notice the film is bathed in a sickly bright light that highlights the tacky quality one comes to expect from live action media aimed at young children. The writing, though, is the worst culprit, because not only is this character arc for our lead so morally corrupt it makes her unlikable to an insatiable degree, but it's so mealy and ham-fisted that you just feel like you're losing IQ points watching these husks of humanity justify actions that no reasonable person would do. It also has to be brought into question, why in this live-action real world are all the animals alongside our eponymous cat and mouse 2D as well? I'm pretty sure it was to make this line work.
Sorry, he's a little animated.
Yeah,
Oh, ha ha ha. That was the best attempt at comedy this film had, and it made me die inside. The fleeting crumbs of enjoyment I got from this film away from Tom and Jerry themselves was Rob Delaney's delightful turn as the blissfully unaware hotel owner, Dubrow. Wait a minute, I just got what that name is meant to make fun of. Something the character isn't even taking the piss out of in the first place. Even the character names in this film suck, which just sums it all up, as the rest of the cast offered nothing apart from set dressing, something they were literally doing in places, I may add. Whilst Space Jam: A New Legacy rightfully got a lot of hate from filmgoers and critics for being a hollow, product placement injected, nostalgia influenced, multimedia dick swinging cash grab, at least you could switch your brain off and enjoy a solid chunk of it? I know I did, and reviewed it to say as much. Tom and Jerry is the worst Warner Brothers cinematic war crime because of how bullish it is about proclaiming this, and was willingly serving narrative gruel to compensate for its lack of effort. Most of the actors performed like they didn't care, reciting an absolutely dire script containing a story that for 90% of its duration felt akin to peeling dead skin off sunburn. It's a film that, when I just think about it, makes me sad. Especially when its HBO Max exclusive animated accompaniment serves up and accomplishes more of what you'd want this feature film to do, proving that without the human gout, this could have been much more enjoyable. The disappointment and anger is very real, and I won't be forgiving the WB anytime soon for producing something so outrageously turgid.
It's very lonely being alone.
We'll stay with you until you feel better.
If you're asked the question, what makes a good family-focused animated movie, you'll probably respond with memorable characters, a story that can facilitate the progression towards a core message, good visuals, a measured voice performance that the script can soar off of, even musical accompaniments. So what do you think happened when a film decided to release with none of those? When a studio uses that as an excuse to peddle an awful film out to unsuspecting parents of young children, it's made even worse. Enter Jungle Beat the movie. You're probably saying to me, Fred, what the hell is this and why did you watch it? Well, it was one of the first I found on Netflix when I kickstarted this whole process back in August. It ended up giving me an insight that was vital, which will become apparent in a little bit. What makes this different to its cheap-looking, serialized online counterpart is that the animals, who at most could only laugh and make noises before, can now speak, enabled thanks to an alien device landing in the jungle, which I have to admit is creative as hell, and I applaud the ingenuity of not just having them speak from the get-go. Although the charm of that runs dry very, very quickly, as the voice actors sound like they were taken hostage and forced to recite their lines as enthusiastically as possible at gunpoint. Because if the characters don't have loud, cheery voices, how are the younglings going to be able to notice them? It's unsettling and paints the most unflattering picture of characters who are just limited and dully transparent shells of minimal animal cliches. That alien device is part of a wider narrative about a shy, British-accented alien who has arrived on Earth to conquer it and hopefully please his father, the leader of their universe-conquering race, but can't find his ship to return home in the hopes that his dad will see his achievement and finally say that he loves and is proud of him. So it's then up to the jungle animals to befriend him and show him what friendship and love really is. I am going to be sick. It's very heavy-handed with that theme and the overall message to where it's infantilizingly obtuse, which is expected given the age range this is aimed at. But even then it's too much, especially when it's actively encouraging its impressionable young viewer to just hug any and everything because you want to show affection, when it's incredibly important to teach your child what other people's personal space is and how to respect it. This film spits at that concept and merrily continues with its reckless abandon. I mean, if it's on the poster, why not exalt it to high heaven, right? The pace is agonizingly slow, assisted in grinding my patience down as once the animals leave the quite colourful and lush forest, their pale shades of red, pink, purple and brown that adorn very bland designs blend into the environments. This film's surroundings are as bargain basement as CGI gets to facilitate the most basic of quote-unquote children's entertainment. It's insulting to the children watching this film's lack of effort, and how it's frankly so noticeable is astounding. It's just an overly excited yet banal experience that frustrates the longer you sit through it, telling a story that for the most part doesn't try to spread its wings a little. Just giving the children watching talking animals a simple to understand story about friendship, and then just letting there be an overly long near 20-minute action set piece with some aliens and it'll be fine, they said. Probably. The original series has garnered billions of views thanks to parents sitting their kids in front of tablets to watch CG animals do animal things. So why not go the extra mile, you would think? Except why, when it's such a disorganized and disconnected plot concept? One that your target audience gains nothing from, and the parents will see right through it. This is why this film pissed me off, not only because it is categorically bad, but an insult to children's entertainment and the intelligence of that audience. There was one flickering light, however, that saved me from going mad. A B-plot where ostrich eggs constantly proclaim their desire to be free and escape from their shells, with one that hatched, yearning to fly, not accepting that her species can't. On one hand, it was a nice mature drive to encourage children to be realistic about their dreams and acknowledge what they can't do, and just focus on what you can. Which, thanks to myopic and predictable plot progression, went exactly where you would expect it to by defying this. And yes, that earlier pun was very much intended. Jungle Beat the movie is an animated film that barely even qualifies as one. Extending and expanding on 5-minute shorts of such little heft to begin with is one thing. Doing so whilst holding contempt for your intended audience by sloppily providing something that doesn't hold any substance, intrigue or merit for them is truly insulting. A film encumbered by beleaguered pacing, annoying one-note characters, a devastatingly thin plot, which was made directionless thanks to an awkward genre mismatch, and shrill voice acting cheerfully proclaiming a derisory script. While I understand that I am not the target audience that this was made with toddlers in mind, that's no excuse to serve up this kind of tripe. Any potential goodwill is undone thanks to the bad lessons it establishes for said audience to learn bad habits from, and does little to stimulate beyond its very rudimentary premise that tries so hard to be more than it is, which is honestly more of a travesty. And while I usually stand by the claim that animation is for everyone, a film like this is an exception. If you're going to target something towards really young children, have some fucking dignity and respect for your viewer, and try to create media that does something to leave a good impression on their developing minds. A film like this, so bereft of any value and heart, doesn't deserve their time, let alone yours.
Hey Keegan, what you doing?
Having a bad day.
Well, just keep hanging in there. Very funny.
Help me up. Oh, thanks.
It made sense to bring Peter Rabbit, Tom and Jerry, Space Jam, The Addams Family and My Little Pony back to the big screen over the last year, because they all have a modern audience and decades of cultural clout under their belts. You know what no one was asking for? An animated film based on Riverdance, something that hasn't been remotely popular on a huge scale since the mid-90s. Riverdance, the animated adventure, which is the stalest white bread of film titles, is a befuddling one, attempting to trace around Cartoon Saloon's successful Irish folktale formula, with a bunch of nonsensical magic trickery, loud brash talking animals, and needless toilet humour thrown into proceedings, whilst basing it in a modern setting to make it palatable to a marketing team definition of what kids want from their animated features, alongside a bunch of Celtic Isle stereotypes which makes the Irish half of my genetic bloodline curdle. The issues this film has are numerous. Why don't I list them all, as I'm never going to talk about this film again once the video ends, and I want to rake it across the coals while I still have the chance. The film kicks off in underwhelming circumstances by killing off a character related to our main protagonist for cheap emotional response from the viewer. Why? Because every generic animated film since Up was released believes this is imperative for success. Especially given that it was done as soon as his spiritual lighthouse role was extolled to his grandson, our flippant, reluctant and young orphaned protagonist, Keegan. I have to mention that last part because, good lord, you have to make a child so feeble that this has to hit home. It's like they markedly put this together just to make us care for him. And if this is only the first one and I'm laughing, you know you've got problems ahead. Keegan is then forced to follow tradition rather than his own hobbies, to make his town happy, all while they compare his lack of real accomplishments to his apparently multifaceted grandpa during the funeral. Cut the kid some slack, for God's sake! The first actual Riverdance performance occurs outside said funeral. The somber sterility of this narrative symbolism attempt is laughable. To be honest, all subsequent performances of which fell out of place despite it being the main selling point of the movie are equally plain and emotionless. Keegan, not wanting to do the important job that's based entirely on spiritual hearsay and nothing else, because he's struggling with grief, and no one is even trying to help him through it. It makes the story progress, with our villain stepping literally into view for the first time, but is relegated to background noise when the townspeople are not actively caring or supporting a child and his widowed grandma at their lowest ebb, which is somehow more morally repugnant and disparaging than the impending rival of a mythical unseen entity threatening to upheave and uproot life as they know it. This is what happens when a film doesn't use its time to flesh out and elaborate necessary depth for its characters, story and conflict, because apparently the young audience watching doesn't need that. Irish comedian Aisling Bea's role as this shop owner is just Aisling Bea being Aisling Bea. I usually enjoy her comedy, but this was as painful as being rubbed against a cheese grater, and made worse as she tries to elevate Keegan's grief-stricken depression by bribing him with sweets, because that's not contentious enough for parents to be pressured into doing when the family pet suddenly dies. What should be a relatively touching scene of Keegan reminiscing about his departed grandfather in the countryside, whom he has a video of river dancing on his iPod because it's the title of the damn movie, before being nonsensically chased by an army of angry, unusually round sheep who nearly kill him, and then proceed to fart on him because this toilet humour is apparently what children like. Moya, his good friend, I think? Their wider relationship is never really touched upon. They just pass each other occasionally and wave, and it just highlights shallow, lazy storytelling. Not to mention the fact that Keegan seemingly gets on with everybody in the town, which honestly makes no sense. Anyway, she transports him to a magical world against his will and uses her noted expertise for river dance as a religious metaphor in bridging the gap between the living and the afterlife. Subtle. Also highlighting that Keegan is not really that interesting or important because he can't do that. Again, way to kick the kid when he's down. Moya reveals herself as a Spanish expat to Ireland because her inability to exhibit flamenco is brought up as a playful barb by Keegan. Making fun of one's admirable assimilation to a new culture is leaning on xenophobic. As a result, she seeks to prove that she can be independent of her Irish upbringing and show off female empowerment by returning to her Spanish roots through dance. Riveting, but juxtaposing Keegan being forcefully brought around to his now locked in tradition role because she is now accepting her tradition and proclaiming it as liberating. You cannot have both. The callous disregard for this film's narrative spine is simply flabbergasting. And it gets worse, because the first showing of the fabled Megalosaurus giganteus, huge Irish stags whose river dance skills keeps the waters flowing, are voiced by Americans. Because the last thing this mostly demure and somber film needed was Kevin Hart impersonators cramming laughs in because they couldn't find an uplifting sensibility anywhere. That female Megalosaurus is taught flamenco because she can't river dance, and instead of being triumphant for Moya and her surge and desire for independent female empowerment like it was intended, it's just more comedic folly. So you sideline the only major female representation in this movie for unimportant exposition, insulting symbolism, and idiotic laughs. What progressive tendencies you have! What hurts even more is that the other Megalosaurus are Irish, making the Americans' placement utterly baffling. Keegan then plays Hurling because his grandpa was apparently a phenomenal player, and through encouragement of his now impending role and importance, a kid extremely lacking in confidence is now magically able to score the most preposterous of points to win the game. It was at this stage watching that my brain melted. Also, Irish reviewers noted that the sport shown is more akin to Gaelic football than hurling because what else could this film get wrong? We finally get our first view of the main villain outside of societal disregard for a child's mental well-being. The huntsman may be a consequence of Keegan not turning on the lighthouse earlier, but uses tepid emotional blackmail to take advantage of the kid's fractured emotional state, which is transparently rejected because now Keegan's got a sense of self-confidence all of a sudden. Wonderful! Not really. Also, what should be a defining moment of the film, with Keegan being shown a 2D montage of the long history of the lighthouse keeper's job that he's now been saddled with right after this happens to empower him, is ignored, only for a sage to do exactly that minutes later with all emotional significance removed from it. The lead deer is then killed by the huntsman to save Keegan and Moya's life. A noble sacrifice. leading to the bumbling, fat and unfunny American deer becoming the clueless leader of the Megalosaurus despite being unable to river dance, all because he witnessed it. Oh, let's just put the really, really funny character who's not actually that funny into a role of stature that nobody believes should be done, because it's funny watching someone squirm under pressure. Oh, this film makes me want to punch whoever made it so badly. Moira and Keegan then return home with only a few hours passing since they depart into this magical world, because it's convenient that all we just saw meant diddly squat as long as it circled back round, with no real sense of impetus, only for the film to end on a rousing, quote-unquote, river dancing finale that falls flat on its arse as Keegan realises he can keep his hobbies along with his new job, something that could have easily been explained to him and that never occurred to him earlier because the plot demanded it. And in a few days, he has lifted the veil of grief from his shoulders. Now that is what I call horseshit, ladies and gentlemen, and if you think all that I have just listed highlights how bad this is, that's the shorthand version. Imagine what this felt like watching through. Oh, good, sweet Jesus. Narratively, this film is flimsy in substance, muddy in moral and contextual quality, and tonally indecisive, accented with meek performances of a limp-wristed script that relied on wasting time for dense and pointless expositional framing, rather than telling a comprehensive story, while lifeless animation barely lifts a finger with most vapid scenery I have seen in so long. Empty, open abscesses of countryside do not account for anything good visually, left to flounder even more so when its character designs are mostly legs to facilitate the dance that is mostly just a shoehorn plot device, which feels tacked on more than imperative to a story that is utterly useless with and without it. It tries to tick a mandated selection of things that apparently make an Irish animated film for children work, which is an insult to Michael Flatley's creation, Irish culture in general, and animated media as a whole by twisting stereotypes and cliches to fit this film's terrible narrative. Riverdance the Animated Adventure was a film no one asked for, inoffensive and bland enough to where it's got virtually nothing of merit to speak of. It's an example of how terrible animation can be at its most unfulfilling and mundane. It doesn't even have the "it's meant for toddlers" excuse that Jungle Beat had, which somehow makes it far worse. Any other year, this would have been #1 without question, but there was some truly awful competition. When your studio sets its sights on making spineless, manufactured films to take advantage of their target audience for profit, this is what you get.
They usually hunt with a pack of velociprey.
Yikes! The tracks I was following were velocipreys. Didn't think I'd be running to his big brother. Are you a hunter? You are, aren't you? Like a real guild hunter.
Video games haven't had it easy over the last 3 decades when it comes to feature adaptations. I mean, Edache made an entire video highlighting that troublesome path, which I partly edited, so if you want to check that out, links in the top right corner. Sonic and Pokemon may have shown that a good one is indeed possible, so there's hope for a franchise to make something out of non-interactive media. However, when fans of an intellectual property clamour for reasons to praise one of these because it's apparently truer to the source material than the live-action version, you have to judge why that desperation exists. Just because it's faithful does not make it objectively good by default, especially when it's nigh unwatchable from a technical perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, Monster Hunter Legends of the Guild was an assault on the senses, and it left me utterly speechless before being sent into a blind rage at just how terrible it was. It's visually outdated and feels incredibly cheap, looking like it was ripped straight from a video game cutscene some 15 to 20 years ago, where the character designs are overly elaborate and gouging on the eye, when in movement, good lord it's choppy and stilted. The texture and lighting look brazenly artificial, which are made to look even worse in scenes of action with haberdash frenetic editing that looks like it was put together by a fucking amateur. The action and match cuts are mistimed and disrupt the flow of pacing, something the film has issues with from the start, I may add, which isn't helped by poor timing of fades to black and other transitions leading into nothing but the hurried advancement of time to break up this plot conveniently into segments that feel separated from the story as a whole. This film is concerned more with cramming everything in to give an illusion of depth, which sadly when coupled with the terrible story and awful voice acting makes it feel laboriously slow for one of its miserly length. The journey of a young monster hunter from brash trainee to mediated expert against a hostile impending doom condenses what looks to be an entire season's worth of established character arcs, conflicts, plot threads, and world building into 58 minutes, which means any overarching importance of all of that is lost for the convenience of time it doesn't even have in the first place, as the nails on a chalkboard performances are maddening to hear, as these voice actors hand up their delivery to make it feel out of its depth, utterly benign, and wholly unlistenable. Why should I care about these characters who annoy me with every single word they speak, who have appeared out of nowhere and proceed to tell us their entire life story in the middle of or after a battle as a form of padding, only to, spoiler alert, die not long after this, when there's no significance to them for me to resonate off of? Speaking of the battles, we have about 3 or so of them. One is claustrophobic and poorly choreographed, the other is overly long and leads nowhere other than fan service baiting and a feeble attempt at a rift between the main cast members, and the final one is so one-sided that their eventual victory is plucked out of thin air as artificial drama and stakes attempt to warrant any semblance of emotion out of the viewer, only for it to be laughed out of a goddamn building. While we do see a character with a giant fuck-off gun taking on a giant fuck-off monster in a giant fuck-off open plain, that doesn't necessarily mean it's good. I've never played the Monster Hunter games and I don't have any interest in doing so, and this substandard attempt at a film makes Monster Hunter honestly look bad, and that coming from a non-fan is concerning. It doesn't even have the excuse of being a made-for-TV film like Earwig and the Witch does to fall back on. Despite being in production for 3 years, none of that time and apparent effort comes across in the final product. When its characters are annoying to hear speak, a script that barely has any depth, zooming through what should be a slow-burning story full of intrigue, to pepper you with needless action and shoehorn dramatic stakes, to try and resemble what it's named after, you know a film overstepped the mark and fell into a chasm to never be found alive. It's an hour of my life I won't get back, and honestly saddens me that video game fans are too proud and loyal to admit when something emanating from a beloved franchise is rancid garbage. I could go on talking about this, but there's just no point. The fact that it isn't my number 1 is a miracle, because the film that did take that spot was something else.
Food, goddammit! Give it to me! Give it to me!
Bet you haven't seen anything like this before, have you, my young comrades? They aren't human. They're worse than animals. They have stained blood.
I have no doubt that some Netflix originals and distributed works have managed to please many, but there have also been some that prove without questionable doubt that when it comes to animated media, Netflix will throw money and occasionally limited resources to something if its algorithm can convince the satiated zombies that we've become to consume them without hesitation, regardless of whether it's objectively good. The concept hurts to fathom, yet at the same time, 8 films that I have rated 1.5 star and lower were marked with that N logo in the left corner. One of them was worse than the lot. True North served up intrigue but left me aching over just how unpalatable it came across, despite its commendable intentions. A film based on the accounts of North Korean defectors who escaped from prison camps should be informative, harrowing, and essential viewing. Animating it, due to an inability to accurately replicate something which visual evidence doesn't freely exist of, sounded like a very smart move. Telling that story from a child's perspective as he grows into an adult and goes through hell on earth, that should fill you with anticipation if you have more than a passing interest in the human rights violations that North Korea has facilitated, like I do. Yet, sadly, the medium of animation and this sobering true story were done such a disservice that I honestly can't exclaim the amount of anger it made me feel. Why was this the case? You may be asking? There's just so many problems. The CGI visuals are downright ugly, looking not too dissimilar to those awful adverts for cheap mobile games. As lifeless and janky in movement as a marionette puppet, these characters and settings are sterile, stone-faced, and unwaveringly bland, fitting the soulless entity one would find under the boot of a regime such as this. But when it looks so awful and interacts with no sense of physical density, amplified by the simplistic cinematography and flat object textures, you can't invest in whatever it shows from that alone. Encumbered more so by some of the lousiest voice performances I have ever heard, reciting a script that sounded like it was penned without much due care and attention. The characters sounded so bereft of range, it was as if it was recorded straight from a bare-bones table read, with awful mouth syncing compounding its misery and furthering that noted disconnect. A Korean or Japanese audio version could have added some gravity to these characters, but as far as I am aware, especially on Netflix, only an English version exists, meaning any potential quality that could offer is lost. What's worse is that the score and sound effects echo those of royalty-free music libraries, making dramatic intent completely null and void thanks to its overly wrought and sappy soap opera-esque temperament. Audio-visually, this film made me apoplectic with rage the longer it went on, as these laughably bad elements makes a scenario and situation that's meant to be terrifying and intense utterly farcical. Maybe the story can save it. Sadly not. Whilst the premise is one that you would want to see, it doesn't reflect that in practice. This child's journey from normality to prisoner is set into motion with little to no real substance so damn quickly, and continues on that path through a cycle of procedurally generated events that only have the thinnest of connections to one another. It's almost as if they just glimpsed over the accounts they had researched, cherry-picked segments and stitched them together in as rudimentary way as they could, and called that a story with no consideration for those watching. The characters exist as a means to an end, with events occurring just to show the cruelty of the regime that they are stuck under, with little to show outside of feeble, non-existent personalities. Once the disgust over its audiovisual ineptitude and lack of story impetus wears off, what has this film got to show for itself? Moments of foreshadowing inevitability occurring, of course. We advance time and witness the callousness of our main character, towing the line to help his mother and sister survive, even if it means alienating all humanity he has, feeling the scorn of his fellow man, which is something that was noted in the synopsis on Netflix, as he realises, after time, that he needs to be a kind and humane person to earn salvation, as religious sentiment of death is rattled off as a quote-unquote calming influence akin to a missionary on the mound. It tries to drag itself out of the gutter and finally have a direction to speak of, but after nearly an hour scraping for crumbs, including the foundation of this haste and turnaround, you can't even take solace in what that manages to bring, as it feels tonally fragmented from everything seen prior, especially due to the lack of discernible weight these moments contain, thanks to most aspects of continuity before and after it having no build-up. If anything, just a fleeting reference or single scene to give the most minimal of bare-bones context. The use of time skipping and its disregard for the impact on the pacing and the oppressive tone suddenly finding brevity when it doesn't rightfully warrant it makes the film even worse than it already was, as it drags its lifeless corpse to its end goal without any heart to speak of. Well, any genuine sincerity, as moments of crowbarred uplifting emotive saccharine, unnecessary toilet humour, and misplaced jovial vulgarity appear, making a film built around severity suddenly not able to reflect its own mantra, betraying its lone selling point and painting my ambivalence with utmost certainty. How can you possibly find such faith-based positivity and caring out of something so barbaric that it wasn't even remotely implied as possible? This isn't Roberto Benigni's Life is Beautiful, where an aching comedic through line was entrenched from the start. This film had to crowbar it in because it had to find a way to reconnect it to the man that we saw at the beginning, regaling of his plight. The way they went about it, having our main character betray his own conscience to fit in with the high command who had basically abused him up until this point, his sister's implied rape and sudden pregnancy, which due to shoddy execution are laughable more than they should be concerning, and a character's torture and coincidental connection with our main character's father to funnel the plot ahead to its conclusion. It just smells of desperation from a narrative that honestly was clutching at straws, trying to find a way to do anything, let alone end with some dignity. Its fragile levee comprehensively broke, and my mind was made up. True North is a film with such a resolute and honourable cause that it shouldn't have been this bad. I think with a lot more money, better direction, a proper screenwriter, and a bit of creative flair cinematography-wise, this film could have been the sobering and memorable tale that it wanted to be. Instead, it was a festival submission that found a home that will take in just about anything if they can make a buck off of it. That premise will get people to watch, regardless of its actual objective worth, and that's what the overseers and the filmmaker behind it want, no matter that everything surrounding it is so terribly executed. The unflinching portrayal of honest brutality is something that critics have been positive about, and I understand where they're coming from, because it opens up a window to many people who've only heard of North Korea as, oh, it's that country who's threatening nuclear war whenever Trump spoke to their leader, or is full of hilarious propaganda fodder. It gives them a stark realization of just how bad it is, and I understand totally how good of a thing that is. But to effectively put this film on a pedestal of critical appraisal based solely on this displays ignorance to the film's inherent lack of quality everywhere else, to where even its lone selling point pales into insignificance around them. With no narrative linchpins to grip onto until it forces itself to find one, characters with zero personality, and over-reliance on its depiction of the violence to elicit response without suitable depth, artificially inflating it by the fakest of positive connotations, all while disgusting visuals, an awful script, woeful voice performances, and insulting music, echo the barest minimum this film could muster as a piece of visual storytelling. It's lumbering through its minefield of shortcomings, trying to save face, and it failed spectacularly. The photos of the prison camps in the credits, which highlighted the research that the filmmaker did, but they were more visually striking than anything this film contained, which is a damning indictment to it. This is a film whose concept shot for the moon, yet somehow both under and oversold itself to the point of oddly comedic absurdity. How fitting is that for a film about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea? True North, deservedly, is my number one, and proof that I'm going to have to be extra critical of whatever animated work Netflix releases or distributes in 2022, especially if stuff like this passes through the net. I've been Freddie Thomas, you've been people watching, this is the CC Network, and I'll see you all next time.